The air inside room 245B of Capitol Hill had that stillness only found before a political storm. Fluorescent lights flickered slightly above polished mahogany tables, casting sterile light over nameplates, half-sipped coffee, and the strained faces of staffers pretending to look relaxed. Representative Imani Porter sat quietly at the far left corner of the committee panel, her notes in order, her blazer pressed, her expression unreadable. She knew how this room worked. She knew how men like Douglas Whitman operated. That morning she'd stopped by Eddie's Diner just a block from the Capitol. The place was mostly empty except for two older gentlemen sipping black coffee and debating last night's football scores. Imani slid into a booth by the window and ordered the usual scrambled eggs, turkey bacon, and wheat toast, no butter. Her phone buzzed just as the waitress set down the plate. "He's going to try and humiliate you today." The message was from Monica Alvarez, a fellow congresswoman and one of the few voices in the chamber Imani actually trusted. Imani stared at the screen for a moment, sighed, then took a bite of her toast. "Let him try," she muttered to herself, her voice barely louder than the hum of the diner's old refrigerator. Now sitting in that committee room, she could already sense Whitman's game unfolding. The Utah senator sat at the center of the opposing panel, flanked by two legal aides and a stack of constitutional law books that looked heavy enough to injure someone. His fingers were steepled eyes, scanning the room like a professor sizing up a freshman class. At 10:01 a.m., the gavel struck, a sharp sound that bounced off the marble walls and settled over the room like a warning bell. The chair called the meeting to order. Today's topic, he announced, is the proposed Voting Access and Integrity Act, sponsored by Representative Porter. There was a slight pause at her name. No applause, no nods, just silence and the scratching of pens on paper. Whitman leaned forward, not even waiting for the chair to finish. "Before we get into the bill, I'd like to provide some historical context," he said, already flipping open a worn copy of the Federalist Papers. No one objected. No one ever did when Whitman spoke. His voice was smooth, practiced, like someone reading bedtime stories about government control to conservative law students. He began with Madison. He always began with Madison. Imani listened in silence, her eyes fixed on the page in front of her, though she wasn't reading. She'd heard this exact lecture before. 2 weeks ago, different committee, different bill, same condescending delivery. Whitman had a talent for making the Constitution sound like something only men like him could possibly interpret. He quoted from Federalist No. 45, emphasizing the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. His voice carried an implied gotcha, as if this singular sentence invalidated every modern effort to secure equitable voting rights. 10 minutes in, he still hadn't mentioned her name again. Staffers behind Imani shifted, checking their tablets, one whispering something to another. A few glances were thrown her way. She felt them, but didn't move. Let them wonder if she was nervous. Let Whitman believe she hadn't prepared. The chair cleared his throat, attempting to bring balance. "Representative Porter, would you like to make an opening statement before we begin formal questioning?" She opened her mouth, but Whitman cut in first. "With all due respect," he said, smiling slightly, "perhaps we can let the grown-ups finish setting the table before the new guests start serving." The room fell awkwardly silent. Imani's eyebrows lifted slightly, but she didn't respond. Not yet. Instead, she picked up her pen and underlined a line from her prepared remarks. The Constitution was never meant to be a gatekeeping tool for privilege. Across the aisle, Whitman smirked, mistaking her stillness for submission. He adjusted his glasses and whispered something to the aide beside him, who chuckled softly. The cameras didn't catch it. But Imani did. She glanced around the room. To her left, Congressman Riley from Ohio was already dozing off, chin resting lightly in his palm. Behind her, Monica sat stone-faced, giving her a subtle nod when their eyes met. It was the kind of nod that said, "You got this." From the back of the room, the faint hum of a live streaming setup kicked in. Someone in the press gallery mouthed, "We're live." Imani knew what that meant. Every word spoken from this point on would live forever online. Whitman began again, diving into a monologue about voter fraud statistics, many of which had already been debunked. Imani let him speak. Let the rope out just a little more. She glanced down at the edges of her notes. At the bottom of the page, she'd scribbled something just that morning at Eddie's diner while sipping burnt coffee. "He'll try to bury you in paper. Don't play defense. Flip the script." The chair finally nodded toward her again. "Representative Porter." She smiled just slightly. "Thank you, Mr. Chair." Then she leaned forward, adjusted her mic, and met Whitman's gaze for the first time that morning. Her voice, calm and unshaken, cut through the room like the early October wind outside the Capitol. "I've reviewed the Voting Access and Integrity Act thoroughly, as have my colleagues, and I welcome any questions on its content or constitutional grounding." She kept her tone light, almost conversational. Whitman leaned back, slightly surprised that she'd skipped the usual preamble about equity and community impact. That was his favorite opening to pounce on. Instead, she had gone straight to the meat of it. "Of course," he said, adjusting his glasses, "but I do hope, Representative Porter, that you'll allow room for a deeper understanding of federalism before insisting that Washington override state election laws. I insist on nothing more than equal access to the ballot box," she replied, still seated, still composed. He blinked, caught off guard by the brevity of her answer. She wasn't playing his game. Yet. A young aide on Imani's left leaned in slightly. "He's trying to set the tone," he whispered. Imani didn't look away from Whitman. "Let him," she whispered back. The next 30 minutes were filled with what looked to the casual observer like a seminar on constitutional law, Whitman style. He quoted court cases, most of which dated before the Voting Rights Act. He referenced demographic trends without citing sources. He carefully inserted veiled critiques of emotion-driven policymaking, and through it all, Imani Porter listened. She didn't fidget. She didn't interrupt. She didn't check her phone. The patience wasn't performative. It was tactical. She knew Whitman's type. He was betting on her rushing to defend herself emotionally, on her losing composure, so he could point to her as the problem with new leadership. He wanted to make this personal, but it wasn't. To Imani, this was about her constituents, the grandmother in Fort Worth who'd waited 4 hours in the heat just to vote. The young man in Dallas turned away because his ID didn't match his new address. The single mom who worked 2 jobs and couldn't make the reduced voting window anymore. This wasn't a game of rhetorical fencing. This was life for people who didn't have staffers or cameras or thick constitutional binders. At exactly 11:28 a.m., Whitman made his first real misstep. "Representative Porter," he began, "you seem to be under the impression that your personal background qualifies you to rewrite constitutional interpretation. But the law, unlike the streets of Fort Worth, isn't guided by anecdotes or activism. The insult was coated in honey, but it landed like a slap." Several people in the gallery gasped softly. A reporter's eyebrows rose as he scribbled rapidly. Imani said nothing. Instead, she uncapped her pen and underlined another line on her notes. Whitman noticed. "Did you have something to add?" She looked up and smiled, just faintly. "I will, when it's my turn." That subtle shift, the first open challenge, rippled through the room. Whitman sat back, blinking. He didn't expect resistance, not yet. He hadn't finished the full list of precedents he planned to cite. The chair tapped his gavel lightly. "Let's move to formal questioning. Senator Whitman, you may begin." And just like that, the gloves came off. Whitman adjusted his mic. "Representative Porter, I've reviewed your statements regarding this legislation. I must say I'm alarmed at what appears to be a fundamental misunderstanding of the 10th Amendment. Would you care to explain your position on federal versus state election authority?" It was a trap, a classic one. Imani straightened her spine, folding her hands on the table. "Certainly," she said, "though I'd first like to clarify something." She paused, letting the silence stretch just enough to command attention. "I don't believe in weaponizing the Constitution to gatekeep who gets to speak in this chamber or who gets to vote in this country. Federal authority in elections is not new. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 remains one of the clearest examples of its necessity. My legislation follows that legacy." Whitman opened his mouth to interrupt, but Imani raised a single finger, not in rudeness, but in controlled assertion. "And Senator, as for my background," she continued, "you may not find value in it. But it taught me that law, when used carelessly, doesn't protect, it oppresses. You could hear a pin drop. Monica leaned back, slightly, eyes shining. One of the press assistants typed with renewed urgency. Whitman narrowed his eyes. "Is that a rebuttal," he asked, "or a testimony?" Imani gave a gentle smile. "Both." The chair, clearly sensing the shift in tone, cleared his throat again. "Let's proceed with the next question." But it didn't matter. The temperature in the room had changed. This was no longer about a bill. This was the beginning of a reckoning. Senator Douglas Whitman leaned forward, the edge of his suit jacket brushing against the nameplate in front of him. He adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat into the mic with a deliberate slowness, a trademark of his style. A calculated pause, a signal to everyone in the room that he was about to educate. "Representative Porter," he began, "I've spent the better part of my career studying constitutional law, arguing it, interpreting it, and defending it in the courts. And I must say, I find your comments troubling." A rustle moved through the room like a sudden wind shift. Imani remained steady, her hands folded gently on the table in front of her. Her eyes met his, without flinching. Whitman continued, his voice rising just enough to suggest authority, but not so much to seem aggressive. "You reference the Voting Rights Act as precedent, and yet you ignore the very framework that made it controversial from the beginning. The 10th Amendment clearly places the majority of electoral control in the hands of the states." James Madison himself wrote. Imani held his gaze, waiting. "That the powers delegated to the federal government are few and defined, while those of the states are numerous and indefinite." He leaned back, slightly triumphant, as if the quotation alone had collapsed her entire position. The room held its breath. Imani blinked slowly, then adjusted her mic. "I'm familiar with Madison's words, Senator. I'm also familiar with the fact that the Constitution has been amended 27 times, including to prohibit racial discrimination in voting. Would you like to talk about the 15th Amendment next?" A low whistle, barely audible, escaped someone in the press gallery. Whitman's stiffened lips pressing together for a moment. "The issue," he said, "is that your proposal ignores the limits of federal power and assumes authority where none is given. That's not how constitutional government works. It's how justice works," Imani replied, her voice still composed, "especially when states abuse the authority you're so quick to defend." The exchange was escalating, but it wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. It was surgical. Deliberate. Whitman flipped through the binder in front of him. His fingers landed on a yellow tab labeled Federalist Quotes. "Predictable." "Let's talk about experience," he said, suddenly shifting the ground beneath their argument. "You've been in Congress for 2 years? Before that, a short tenure in the Texas state legislature. And before that, a public defender," correct. Imani tilted her head slightly. "Civil rights attorney. And yes, I represented clients who didn't have the luxury of policy debates. They had jail time. Or voter suppression. Or both," I see, Whitman said with a thin smile. "And now you believe that qualifies you to reinterpret centuries of constitutional interpretation?" "No," Imani said, leaning forward. "I believe it qualifies me to ask why your centuries of interpretation keep failing real people." Silence. This wasn't the rebuttal he expected. He was used to stammering backpedaling or rehearsed talking points. But Imani wasn't flustered. She was calm, confident, and worse for him, she was resonating. "You want to talk about experience?" she continued. "Then let's talk about yours. You've written books, clerked for a Supreme Court justice, spent decades in the Senate. But how many of those years were spent sitting in courtrooms next to clients who didn't know if they'd get to vote again, or walk free, or see their kids?" Whitman shifted in his seat. "How many voter ID laws have you seen used to target people who look like me? How many families have you helped fight a system that wasn't built for them? How many?" He didn't answer, because he couldn't. In the gallery, phones were up now. Not discreetly, boldly. People knew something was happening. Something rare in the dry corridors of congressional hearings. A shift. Whitman tried to reassert control. "This isn't about emotion," he said. "This is about law, about precedent, about maintaining the integrity of constitutional balance." Imani didn't blink. And yet somehow that balance always tips in favor of those already standing tall. Not those struggling to stand at all. The words hung like fog. The chair tapped the gavel, more nervous than commanding. "Let's keep the discussion on topic," Imani nodded. "I am on topic. The Constitution isn't just a document to be preserved, it's a promise to be fulfilled." Whitman narrowed his eyes. "Your rhetoric is clever, but cleverness doesn't change the fact that the Constitution says what it says." And people like you, Imani replied, "Keep pretending it says only what you want it to." Gasps. Audible this time. Monica Alvarez, seated 2 rows behind Imani, broke into a smile. Whitman fumbled slightly with his binder. His finger traced the edge of a highlighted paragraph, but didn't lift the page. "I think we've drifted into speech-making," he said, trying to salvage the moment. "Not at all," Imani replied smoothly. "I'm answering your question with the kind of clarity your footnotes don't offer," he scoffed. "So now courtroom activism is superior to constitutional scholarship." "No," Imani said. "It's complementary when done in good faith. But the people who suffer under bad law don't get to debate its theory. They live its reality." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was reverent. A recognition that something powerful had just been said. Something that made even seasoned politicians glance at each other, like students realizing the substitute teacher actually knew more than the curriculum. Whitman leaned forward once more, his voice lower now, almost forced. "I still maintain, Representative Porter, that your legislation oversteps federal authority. And I maintain she said that your authority has too often been used to keep the gates closed. My job is to open them." He opened his mouth, closed it again. The chair shuffled some papers, clearly uncertain of what to do next. Let's break for a short recess before proceeding with the next panel," he mumbled. The gavel struck again, but this time it didn't sound like order. It sounded like surrender. Imani Porter didn't get up right away when the recess was called. While most of the room moved, some stretching, some whispering into phones, others power walking toward the hallway, she remained seated, calm, poised. The binder in front of her was still closed. She hadn't opened it once since the hearing began. Across the room, Senator Whitman stood by the committee table, whispering sharply to a young aide who kept nodding too quickly. He was flustered, and flustered men made mistakes. Imani tapped her fingers softly against her water cup, her gaze never drifting far from him. She didn't need to win anything. She just needed to reveal the truth and let it do the work for her. By the time the chair called the committee back to order, the room had filled again. Staffers resumed their places, cameras refocused, and the tension previously hidden under layers of procedure was now naked and humming in the air. Imani adjusted her microphone as the chair cleared his throat. "We'll resume our discussion on the proposed Voting Access and Integrity Act. Senator Whitman, your final line of questioning." Whitman didn't look at the chair. He was watching Imani, and when he spoke, the edge in his voice had dulled, but only slightly. "Representative Porter," he said, "what we're seeing here is exactly why experience matters in these discussions. Constitutional interpretation is not a performance. It requires years of dedicated study of understanding precedent and the historical context of each clause. It's not something one picks up after a few years in courtrooms." Imani nodded once as if confirming the weather report. Whitman went on, his words smoother now, but colder. "You are no doubt a passionate speaker, but passion doesn't rewrite law, and I fear that your approach may inspire others to believe that conviction alone is a substitute for knowledge. That's not only dangerous, it's irresponsible." A few Republican aides were already grinning. They thought he had landed something. They always did when he slipped in the dangerous card. Imani didn't respond right away. She waited. She let the silence breathe. Then slowly she leaned into the mic. "You want to talk about expertise, Senator? Let's talk about what that really means." Whitman tilted his head slightly, preparing another quote, but she didn't give him time. "You've spent years studying what the Constitution says," she continued. "I've spent years fighting for what it's supposed to do." Pause. "You've written books about constitutional theory. I've represented people whose constitutional rights were being violated in real time with real consequences." A reporter's fingers flew across a keyboard. "And you know what the difference is between your expertise and mine?" she asked, her voice still calm. "Your expertise tells you what the law says on paper, My expertise shows me what the law does to people in practice." She didn't blink. Around the room, even Whitman's staffers had stopped moving. "Your interpretation of the Constitution," she went on, "is being used right now to deny Americans their fundamental right to vote. In my district, in yours, across this country. You can pretend it's about balance or precedent, but the impact tells a different story." Whitman shifted uncomfortably. "This committee," Imani continued, "has spent years debating legislation, while people outside these walls are losing their access to democracy. We call it policy in here, but out there it's a closed polling place, a mismatched ID. A felony from 20 years ago that never quite gets forgiven." Whitman opened his mouth, but she raised a hand slightly, not to silence but to finish. "But here's what really bothers me about this conversation, Senator. You sit there with your Harvard degree and your clerkship and your titles, and you treat constitutional law like it's an exclusive club. Like only a few get to speak, and you act like those of us who came here through different doors aren't qualified to be in the room." That hit. Hard. Someone near the back let out a soft, The Constitution, she said, wasn't written for Harvard law professors. It wasn't written just for senators. It was written for we the people, all of us, including the people you think are too emotional, too inexperienced, too unqualified to understand their own rights. Her voice rose not in volume, but in gravity. "So yes, Senator, you're right, expertise matters. But maybe, just maybe, the real constitutional experts aren't the ones who spent years studying it in libraries. Maybe they're the ones who've spent years fighting to make sure it actually works." Gasps now, audible. Whitman's mouth opened slightly, then closed. The chair sat motionless. Imani wasn't finished, because at the end of the day, Senator, your version of constitutional expertise has given us voter suppression gerrymandering and policies that benefit the few at the expense of the many. And forgive me, but I'm less interested in your credentials than I am in your results. Silence. Then cameras flashed. A staffer scribbled something onto a legal pad. "Get this clip online now." Whitman's lips tightened. He tried to recover. "Representative Porter, I think you're mischaracterizing my position," but she cut him off with surgical precision. "The only thing your interpretation of the Constitution has required," she said, "is that real Americans lose their voting rights while you write law review articles about why that's good for democracy." She let the silence sit, then delivered the final strike. "That's not expertise, that's academic malpractice." The room was frozen. Even the chair forgot to tap his gavel. Whitman stared ahead, blank. Someone in the gallery whispered, "That's it. He's done." And for the first time since he took his seat that morning, Douglas Whitman had no response. Senator Douglas Whitman's hands were gripping the edge of the table now. His knuckles were white. For over a decade he'd held court in this very chamber, lecturing, interrogating, and dismantling witnesses like a courtroom surgeon. His voice, his credentials, his binders, his years of service, they had always been enough. But not today, and certainly not against her. Imani Porter hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't pointed fingers or shouted slogans. She'd done something far worse in Whitman's eyes. She'd made him irrelevant. The chair, clearly rattled, attempted to regain control. "Senator Whitman, do you wish to respond before we close this round of questioning?" Whitman adjusted his tie, though it wasn't crooked. He opened his binder, then closed it again. He cleared his throat. "I think what we're seeing here today is a clear example of why emotional appeals are dangerous in constitutional debates." Imani tilted her head just slightly. Whitman continued, words tumbling faster than usual. "You can talk about real people all you want, Representative Porter, but at the end of the day, the Constitution means what it means, not what we want it to mean. Feelings don't override law." He paused as if expecting agreement, but the room was still, dead still. Even the cameras seemed to wait. "This isn't about therapy," he added. "This is law, and law requires discipline, precision, and yes, experience." Imani didn't flinch. "Experience," she said slowly, doing what Whitman blinked. Imani stood. She didn't need permission. The energy in the room had already shifted toward her. "You've spent years in this building," she said, "writing policies, debating theories, and defending systems that haven't served everyone equally. And you call that expertise." She took a step forward, not aggressively but deliberately. I've spent years in courtrooms, real courtrooms, sitting beside people denied housing, denied fair trials, denied the right to vote. And every time I asked why, the answer came back wrapped in legislation someone like you wrote. Whitman opened his mouth, but the words didn't come. You talk about the Constitution like it's a fortress to defend, she said. But for many of us, it's been a locked door. And every time we get close to opening it, someone like you adds another bolt. A sharp inhale from somewhere in the gallery. Imani stepped closer to the center of the room, her voice carrying now, not loud but full. You want to talk about qualifications, Senator? She asked. Then, let's talk about them. She raised a hand, palm open. Your qualifications let you argue theory. Mine forced me to argue for someone's life. Another step. Your qualifications come from classrooms and clerkships. Mine come from sitting across from people broken by a system you keep insisting works just fine. Another step. She was now standing between the two rows of desks, equidistant from Whitman and the rest of the committee. Your experience is about interpreting words. Mine is about witnessing their consequences. Silence. No typing, no murmurs. Just her. And then she delivered the blow. So yes, Senator, you're right. The Constitution isn't therapy. But it also isn't a philosophy textbook that you get to interpret from the comfort of your office, while real Americans suffer from your version of its meaning. Whitman's face had gone from pale to pink to something dangerously red, but he couldn't interrupt. He wouldn't dare. Imani's voice dropped slightly. You've said a lot today about what the Constitution says, but not once have you talked about what it does. Not once have you acknowledged the pain it's caused, not because it's flawed, but because men like you have used it as a weapon instead of a shield. She returned to her seat, but didn't sit. Instead, she rested both hands on the table, leaned forward, and said, Expertise isn't just about knowing what's written. It's about knowing what's missing and having the courage to fix it. The final word echoed. And then, silence again. But it wasn't empty. It was electric. The chair finally cleared his throat. Thank you, Representative Porter. We'll move to the next round of testimony. But before he could call the next name, Whitman, against the advice of everyone in his corner, spoke again. You think I don't care? He said, his voice tight. You think just because I quote Madison and wear a suit that I'm out of touch? He stood too quickly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. I've worked in this building for 15 years. I've clerked for a Supreme Court justice. I've helped pass legislation that protects this country. Don't stand there and tell me I don't understand suffering just because I don't wear it on my sleeve. Imani didn't respond. She let the room answer for her. Because in that moment, everyone knew this wasn't about suffering. This was about listening. And Whitman had failed. The chair called a recess, his voice thin and uncertain. As the gavel struck, Whitman's team rushed to his side, whispering damage control strategies. One aide held up a phone with a Twitter feed already flooded by a clip of Imani's speech. It had over 600,000 views in 12 minutes. Monica approached Imani slowly. You okay? She whispered. Imani nodded. Better than him. And then, without fanfare, she gathered her notes, zipped her bag, and walked calmly out of the room. The hallway outside was buzzing, reporters, staffers, interns, all speaking in hushed, excited tones. Some stared at her, others applauded silently, but she kept walking. At the end of the corridor, someone from her district, an older black woman in a gray cardigan, reached out and gently touched her arm. Thank you, the woman said, voice trembling, for saying what needed to be said. Imani placed her hand over the woman's and smiled. I wasn't the first, she said. I just happened to have the mic today. Imani Porter sat quietly in the corner of the committee room as staffers scrambled to reassemble the session. Senator Douglas Whitman had not returned yet. His seat remained empty, his nameplate untouched. Whispers filled the room like static. He's in the hallway, getting briefed, trying to spin this. But none of it mattered now. The video clip of Imani's takedown was already viral. News headlines were flooding timelines. Commentators, some conservative, some liberal, all shocked, were calling it a defining moment in political accountability. Imani sipped from her water bottle, watching a young intern nearby try to steady her hand as she took notes. Monica leaned in from behind and whispered, "He's going to try to come back. Swing harder. Be ready." Imani didn't turn around. "He's already lost. Now I just have to remind him." At precisely 1:12 p.m., Whitman returned. His face was taut. He nodded to the chair stiffly and took his seat without looking at Imani. She could see his staff had tried to refresh his talking points, new tabs in his binder, a second iPad at his side, a highlighted index card. He was going to try again. But Imani had already moved on from defense. This was the final round. The chair tapped the gavel. "We'll resume discussion of H.R. 7823. Senator Whitman, you may proceed." Whitman spoke quickly, not rushed, but with the tone of someone trying to prove he hadn't lost control. "I'd like to refocus this conversation on constitutional clarity. Representative Porter has made impassioned arguments, but we must separate activism from accuracy." Imani's pen tapped softly on her notepad. Whitman went on. "The Constitution has withstood centuries of challenges, but it was not designed as a tool for social work. It was constructed with checks, balances, and a precise distribution of power, turning it into a therapy manual." Imani looked up. "That was it. You keep saying that," she said, interrupting. Whitman blinked. "Excuse me, that the Constitution isn't therapy," she said, voice low but firm. "But the way you're using it, it's not law either. It's malpractice." There was no gasp this time, only quiet recognition. Whitman narrowed his eyes. "Are you suggesting my legal interpretation is unethical, I'm saying?" "Your interpretation has caused more harm than help," she said. "And if doctors practice medicine the way you practice law, ignoring outcomes, ignoring harm, they'd be sued, disbarred, imprisoned." He opened his binder. But she didn't stop. "You talk about the Constitution as if it's holy scripture, but ignore the amendments meant to correct it. You quote Madison, but forget Selma. You cite structure, but erase struggle." Her voice rose slightly, not loud, but undeniable. "You think activism is separate from accuracy? No, Senator. Activism is what made the Constitution better, more accurate, more complete." She stood again, and this time everyone leaned in. "When the founders wrote that all men are created equal, they didn't mean me. They didn't mean the people I represent. They didn't mean the millions who fought to make this country mean what it says." Whitman scoffed, reaching for his index card. "That's a gross oversimplification." "No," she said. "It's a correction." She stepped away from the desk again, walking slowly along the inside edge of the committee circle. "I've sat across from women whose voting rights were taken because they missed a deadline no one told them existed. From men who lost access to polling places moved without notice. From young people told their IDs weren't valid enough, their addresses not stable enough, their voices not important enough." Pause. "And every one of those barriers came wrapped in legal interpretation, just like yours." Whitman gripped his pen. "You've weaponized scholarship," she continued. "You've made the law sound so complex that the people it governs are too intimidated to challenge it, and you call that brilliance." She turned to face him directly now. "I call it malpractice." The room was still. Not a single person moved. Not the chair, not the aides, not even the reporters. Imani leaned slightly forward. "Because what good is expertise if it protects power but not people? What good is law if it only serves the lawmaker?" Whitman's face was unreadable, but behind his eyes something cracked. "You came here to teach me the Constitution," she said, "but all you've done is prove that you've forgotten who it was written for." And then she sat. Just like that. Monica exhaled behind her, quietly muttering, "That's it. That's the end." But the chair was still frozen, hand hovering near the gavel. Whitman looked down at his binder again. Then, without turning a page, he closed it. The mic was still on, but he didn't speak, because there was nothing left to say. The hearing ended in silence, not the kind laced with tension or disbelief those had come earlier. This silence was different, heavier, like the sound a room makes when something historic has just happened, and everyone knows it, but doesn't quite know what to do next. The gavel fell, cameras clicked, but no one rushed out. Even Senator Whitman remained in his chair, eyes fixed on some point beyond the far wall, as if trying to undo what had already been done. Imani Porter packed her things slowly. She didn't smile, she didn't wave, she didn't acknowledge the dozen eyes tracking her every move. She simply stood, nodded once to the chair, and walked out. The hallway was packed. Reporters, aides, interns, all waiting for a glimpse, a quote, anything. Monica slipped into place beside her. "Don't stop," she whispered. "Just keep walking." But then someone broke through the line. An older man. Civil rights pin on his lapel, eyes wet. He didn't say a word. He just reached out and touched Imani's arm. Then he stepped back and let her pass. That moment would appear on the front page of the Washington Post the next morning. By evening, the clip had been viewed over 15 million times. Major news anchors abandoned their scripts to replay her final words. "What good is expertise if it protects power but not people?" Social media dubbed her the People's Professor. Hashtags like Imani knows, #constitutional real talk, and #academic malpractice trended worldwide. But the impact wasn't just viral. Within 48 hours, 3 progressive think tanks issued statements praising her framing of lived experience as constitutional expertise. A Georgetown law professor wrote Porter's approach marks a fundamental redefinition of legal authority from theoretical to experiential. This is the future. Whitman's book tour for the American Framework was quietly postponed. A prominent conservative radio host admitted on air, "I don't agree with her politics, but damn, she beat him fair and square." And then came the fallout. 2 weeks later, a young congressional candidate in Ohio quoted Imani's words in a campaign ad. "It's not about knowing what the law says, it's about knowing what it does." The ad went viral. In Michigan, a law student group rebranded its constitutional law journal to include a new section called Applied Justice, citing Porter's testimony as inspiration. In North Carolina, a freshman legislator used her strategy to shut down a gerrymandering argument from a 10-term Republican senator. Suddenly, everything had changed. Seniority was no longer armor. Credentials were no longer shields. Now politicians had to answer not just for what they knew, but for what they ignored. Whitman, meanwhile, was quieter. He stopped dominating hearings. He declined interviews. Rumors swirled that leadership had asked him to take a step back. The man once feared for his precision now inspired pity for his detachment. His silence, once seen as gravitas, now felt like defeat. Imani, for her part, remained steady. She refused late-night show offers, declined a TED Talk, turned down 6-figure book deals. Her focus remained on legislation on the Voting Access and Integrity Act that had sparked it all. And when the bill passed out of committee with bipartisan support, barely but undeniably, she didn't hold a press conference. She just issued a statement. "Democracy is not defended in grand speeches, but in consistent action. This is a step, not a victory lap." Months later, she returned to that same hearing room for a different session. Some of the faces had changed, some hadn't. Whitman wasn't there, but his empty seat still seemed to speak. When Imani sat down, one of the new committee members, a young Latina from Arizona, leaned over and whispered, "I saw your hearing. It's the reason I ran." Imani nodded, then flipped open her binder. No mic check, no preamble. She didn't need an audience. She already had the floor. There's something about quiet strength that lingers long after the noise fades. In the stillness of that hearing room, long after the cameras had been turned off and the chairs pushed back under the tables, a shift had taken place, not in volume, but in weight. It wasn't just about a speech or a win. It was about what happens when someone from the Black community, someone often dismissed, doubted, or overlooked, stands in a space where they were never expected to thrive, and simply refuses to be silenced. And maybe that's the lesson that stays with us the longest. Dignity doesn't shout. It stands. It listens. It remembers. And then when the moment calls, it speaks in a voice that echoes far beyond the walls it's trapped in. We're reminded that the measure of a person is not found in their resume or their title, but in their resolve when tested. Justice, real justice, often comes not from the loudest voices, but from the ones we almost didn't hear at all. In a world still too quick to judge based on what people wear, how they speak, or where they come from, This story is a quiet rebellion, a reminder that the Black community has always known truth, may walk in wearing humble shoes, but it carries the power to change everything. Like the smell of rain on hot pavement, or the hum of an old song on a late-night drive, some moments return when we least expect them, reminding us of who we are and what we must never forget. So take a breath, let the story settle. And if it stirred something in you, if it reminded you of a loved one a moment, or a quiet courage of your own, consider passing it on. Someone out there, perhaps in the Black community, or maybe right in your own neighborhood, is waiting for a story like this to believe a little harder in themselves. Because sometimes it only takes one still voice in a loud room to remind us, don't ever underestimate where truth and justice might come from. It's often from the very place we were taught to ignore.